want to thank Catherine for moderating, and just to say that this is my third session I'm presenting at Limmud, and it's exciting to be presenting again. And I'm so impressed that Limmud managed to transfer so nimbly from an in-person to an online format. And I think this is a real tribute to the work of the board and the volunteers. And I also want to welcome descendants of Rabbi Porush, who I know are joining us from different parts of the world. And it's a great honor to have you listening into this presentation. So this is a session on the Hashkafa, the Weltanschauung, the religious worldview of Rabbi Dr Israel Porush. Let me just begin by saying a little bit about who he was, and then we will look at, first of all, is his intellectual biography, how he developed into maturity as a religious thinker, and then we will examine some of his major statements drawn from different parts of his writings and see his point of view on different Jewish issues. Of course, he became something of interest to me because he's one of my predecessors. He was the chief minister of the Great Synagogue in Sydney from 1940 to 1972. He was also the head of the Sydney Beth Din for those years, and for a few years afterwards, he didn't resign from the Sydney Beth Din until 1975. He founded the Association of Jewish Ministers in Australia and New Zealand in 1946 and remained their president until 1975. He was the president of the Jewish Historical Society from 1948 to 1974. He taught at the University of Sydney in the Semitic Studies Department. Within the Great Synagogue, he presided over an era of extraordinary growth, essentially as a combination of the 10-pound POMs, the British immigrants, and also the Holocaust survivors and other refugees or migrants from Europe came to Australia, to Sydney. Not all, but a certain number of those went to the Great Synagogue. And so he saw an expansion, I think almost a doubling of the membership of the Great Synagogue, the building of the War Memorial Centre, adding a whole set of cultural and educational facilities, the founding of GSY, Great Synagogue Youth, also down to him. But above all, or to draw it all together, he was referred to by Rabbi Apple, his successor at the Great Synagogue, as the Uncrowned Chief Rabbi of Australia. And that was really his role. As we know, although the Chief Rabbi in London, not now, but for a long period of time, had official oversight of the Australian community, being many, many thousands of miles away, it wasn't a day-to-day relationship with the ins and outs of the community. And so Rabbi Porush, in his time, became the primary religious spokesman of the Jewish community. He was the primus inter pares, the first among equals of the rabbinate itself, within the rabbinate, and he was also the go-to religious spokesman for the community, first in Sydney, and then over the whole of Australia. And of course, he was recognised with the OBE in 1966, which also recognised these achievements. So that's what he did in Sydney. But who was the man who came to Sydney in 1940? What do we know about his intellectual development, his intellectual biography? So let's go back to Jerusalem in 1907. The name Porush is derived from this word Perushim, the ones who separate, because he was a descendant of a distinguished family of students of the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was the greatest rabbi of 18th century Lithuania and a staunch opponent of the Hasidim, an attitude which we'll see somewhat also in Rabbi Porush's views. And he encouraged his students to go to live in the land of Israel, to settle the land of Israel, the old Yishuv, in the late 18th and early 19th century. And the Porush family were one of those families that came over from Lithuania in the 19th century. Different branches came over at different points in the 19th century and came to live in the land of Israel, in Jerusalem, in pretty shocking poverty and total religious dedication to their Lithuanian Yiddish-speaking way of life, Jewish Lithuanian Litvak way of life, and created an enclave of Lithuanian piety in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel. Rabbi Porush was very aware of his ancestry, very proud of his ancestry, and their history and their contribution. But in fact, he was from perhaps a less typical branch of the family. There are still Porushes actually active in Haredi politics, ultra-Orthodox politics in Israel, and they are distant cousins of our Rabbi Porush. Rabbi Menachem Porush was a very well-known and important member of the Knesset for many years. That's a cousin of his. But in fact, the family kind of split in two, not in terms of a personal rift, but there was definitely two branches of the family which followed very different approaches. There was the Porush Glickman family, who essentially maintained all of the old ways which they'd inherited. They inherited that from the 19th century and carried it forward into the 20th century. So uncompromising orthodoxy, traditional dress, anti-Zionism. In fact, I was in Israel for the most recent time in January, and I went to, for a friend's wedding, I went to his Ufruf, a little shul in Yemin Moshe, and there was a Rabbi Porush there who has some sort of role in that shul, and he's wearing the Yerushalmi dress. He's wearing the traditional silk, white and gold striped dress of a Yerushalmi, of an old Jerusalemite family, because his family did not modernize. They retained the traditional way of the Porushes. And in fact, I went to chat to him afterwards, and he said, "Oh yes, my cousin Israel Porush in Sydney came from this branch, and I come from a different branch." Rabbi Porush's branch was the Porush Mandels, and they did adopt modern dress and sub-modern attitudes. They were much more sympathetic to religious Zionism, identified, of course, with the Mizrahi faction. They had some secular education that grew as the years went on. Gershon Porush, who was Rabbi Porush's grandfather, was an assistant and an interpreter at the Shaare Zedek Hospital in Jerusalem from the time it opened in 1902 until his death in 1916. His son, and Rabbi Israel Porush's father, Elias, was determined, A, not to live on charity, and B, not to take a religious profession that was not an interest of his. So he was found a job at Shaare Zedek too, and he served there for 51 years at the hospital, and eventually he became the administrator of all of its financial affairs. Now, the head of Shaare Zedek was a German Jew from Cologne called Dr. Moshe Wallach. And he brought from Cologne the ideology of Torah im Derech Eretz, the ideology of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who has been the Rabbi of Frankfurt in the second half of the 19th century, an ideology of combining Torah, adherence to the Torah and study of the Torah, quite strict orthodoxy, with an openness and engagement with the best of Western culture, Goethe and Schiller, and the best of Western civilization as they understood it. So Dr. Wallach was very extreme, actually, in his halachic views, his views of Jewish law. For example, he wouldn't allow the hospital to use the electricity that came from the general supply in Jerusalem, because the generators of the power plants were manned by Jews on Shabbat. So he had to have a generator built for the use of the hospital exclusively, which was run along Shabbat observant lines. So very strict when it came to halachic positions, but very much imbued with this ideology that you can combine Torah with Western civilization. And that has an influence on at least Rabbi Porush's branch of the Porush family. So for example, Rabbi Porush's sisters were sent to high school, which was against the opposition of other branches of the family, but they were given a high school education. Nevertheless, the family remained Yiddish speaking at home, and Israel Porush was sent to a cheder, a traditional cheder, and he was discouraged from playing with the secular boys who lived in the same area. He went on to Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, and from the age of 9, essentially learned just Talmud. A bit of some other religious content, but basically Talmud and not much else from the age of 9 onwards. So the education for the son, as opposed to the daughters, was still very much along traditional lines that had always been practiced by the Litvaks of Jerusalem. But at 15, under the influence of Dr. Wallach and the way Elias had become a supporter, a sympathizer with Hirschian ideals, Rabbi Porush was sent to Germany to receive a Torah and Derech Eretz education. He was sent to Frankfurt, which of course was Rav Hirsch's old community, then run by the Breuer family. Rabbi Solomon Breuer was Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch's son-in-law, and he was enrolled in the yeshiva, the Hirsch yeshiva, the Breuer yeshiva in Frankfurt, which, although called the yeshiva, combined both Jewish and secular studies. Now, the interesting thing was that although he picked up German, which he really wanted to do, and I think Rabbi Porush was very adept in languages, because if you read his English writings, he essentially learned English in his 20s and 30s, and it reads with an extraordinarily fine writer of English for somebody who learnt it so late in life. So when he went to Germany originally, he was very pleased to learn German, but he found the religious instruction lacking, because he had been at the center of an extraordinarily powerful, intellectually powerful Lithuanian milieu. And although the German Orthodox Jewry was known for many, many good things, the Talmudic teaching just wasn't at the same standard, let's say in a school in Frankfurt. There were places where it wasn't the same standard as he found in Jerusalem, but not the high school for boys in Frankfurt. So that was a disappointment to him. And also he found the community rather rigid and rather snobbish, which has also been an accusation which has been levied at the Hirsch Breuer community. And I think that snobbishness and that rigidity is to do with Rabbi Hirsch's other main plank, which is Austritt, which is this commitment to total institutional separation from any other non-Orthodox stream. So the Rav Hirsch and his descendants in Frankfurt just would have no institutional links whatsoever, not only with anyone who wasn't Orthodox, but anyone who was Orthodox who cooperated with the non-Orthodox. Very, very rigid and very unbending, almost a monomania about this issue. So he didn't like Frankfurt very much, and so he decided to move to the Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary in Berlin. Berlin, much more cosmopolitan than Frankfurt, and the orthodoxy of Berlin also very different, because the seminary in Berlin was designed to produce rabbis not only for an Austritt community like Frankfurt, but also a more engaged community. In Germany, the system of the Gemeindes, of the congregations, the communities, was everyone paid into a central fund, and there'll be an Orthodox synagogue or a Neolog synagogue, a Reform synagogue, each with their own clergy, each with their own premises, but paid for by a central fund, which everyone paid into. That was the model that Hirsch rejected when he advocated for Austritt. But these Orthodox synagogues needed rabbis, and the seminary in Berlin, founded by Rabbi Israel Hildesheimer in the 1870s, was created to provide rabbis the whole range of synagogues. So it was a more tolerant place, a more open place, still very influenced by Rav Hirsch's philosophy and theology, but not committed to Austritt in the same way. And the head of that seminary at that time, it always had very distinguished rectors, as they were called, was Rav Avraham Eliyahu Kaplan, who was a sort of extraordinary figure, died very young, died in his 30s, while Rabbi Porush was at the seminary, a genius from Lithuania, an Elui, a young genius from Lithuania, who was totally schooled and trained in the tools of Lithuanian Litvak Talmudic analysis, but was also inspired by the Muslim movement, which is the movement of Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, which concentrated on personal, ethical, and moral development, and also had some sympathies with Chassidut, with this Hasidic tradition, which the Porushes had always been very much against. So under his leadership, there's no way that Rabbi Porush would be disappointed in the quality of the religious learning. So he goes there initially, He's also at a high school in Germany at the same time. So he's learning at high school for part of the day and in the seminary for part of the day. And then he became a rabbinical student in 1927. And at that point, the rector is Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, who later becomes known by the title of his important book of Responsa, his important book of Jewish legal decisions called the Seridei Eish, the remnants of the fire, because they were mostly destroyed in the Holocaust and some were salvaged by a student of his. And another genius from the East who also wanted to also take on the tools of Western academic study of Talmud. And that was something that you could do in the seminary. You could be both a traditional scholar, and also you could start using and writing using the tools of the academy of the universities. And that's what Rav Weinberg did. He was actually very impressed with Rabbi Porush, or not yet Rabbi Porush, because of his mathematical skill. He went on to do mathematics at Berlin University, and then eventually went to Marburg University, where he got his PhD in mathematics. And Rabbi Weinberg liked the fact that Rabbi Porush was both a Talmid Chacham, a real scholar who had years and years and years of concentrated Talmudic learning under his belt, which far exceeded any of the students from Germany that could have gone to the seminary. So he must have massively outclassed almost all of the students in his year. Only other people from the East could have competed Rabbi Porush as a Talmudist. So he had those abilities, and he also had this interest in mathematics. He had a wider intellectual interest, and the curriculum at the seminary was rather broad, and the people there were rather broad. So in addition to just learning Talmud and also halakha, Jewish law needed for the smicha, for the rabbinical ordination exams, there was also Bible, history, philosophy, grammar, even the geography of the land of Israel was covered in the curriculum. There were Zionists and non-Zionists. There were those from Hasidic backgrounds and those not from Hasidic backgrounds. One of his fellow students was Eliezer Berkowitz, who came from Hungary, as it happens, also had a very strong background. And they would later become colleagues briefly in Sydney, because Rabbi Berkowitz was here from 1946 to 1950 as the rabbi of the Central Synagogue. While he was at the seminary, Rabbi Porush adopted a self-consciously moderate approach. Obviously, there were camps in the seminary, and there was a range of different views, but he wanted to adopt a moderate approach. So, for example, he joined Young Mizrahi, so he firmly affiliated at this point with Zionism. He attended mixed youth groups, such as he would later found at the Great Synagogue in the form of Great Synagogue Youth. He went to theatre and concerts and even opera. He would shake women's hands. He was part of the group in the seminary, which was, as I say, self-consciously part of the moderate or the lenient end. So he finishes his time at the seminary. He gets his PhD from Marburg. He gets his smicha from the seminary. When he applied to Sydney, he wrote out his smicha. So I've not seen his original smicha, but I have seen his handwritten copy of it, which he sent to Sydney with his papers of application. And that was, of course, signed by Rabbi Weinberg. And in fact, the rest of the faculty. The custom at the seminary was that the whole faculty signed your smicha, your rabbinical ordination. And there is a codicil, a famous codicil at the end of the smicha, which says this smicha is revoked if the holder of it takes a job in a non-Orthodox synagogue. So still a very strong anti-reform attitude. So even though he did not want to separate entirely and institutionally from cooperation with all of the non-Orthodox streams, as we will see, in terms of an ideological opposition, that was unwavering, and also a personal commitment to Orthodoxy was also unwavering. So it was very much cooperation in certain areas, social, political, but a resistance to any compromise religiously. So he graduated in July 1932. He was qualified to serve both as a rabbi and as a dayan, because he was qualified in all four sections of the Shulchan Aruch, all four sections of the Code of Jewish Law, covering both daily life, kashrut, personal status issues, conversion, marriage, divorce, and also civil and monetary law. So he had the qualification known as Yora Yora Yadin Yadin. He can rule, Yora Yora, and Yadin Yadin, he can judge. He can pass down a judgment in a Bet Din. And that will become very useful for him. He now had to find a job as a rabbi, and of course, late 1932, things were going to get very rough very quickly. And so he found his way to London. He found that London would be a good place for him to serve as a rabbi. Because he was from Palestine, it was that he had some sort of association with British citizenship, because at that point, Palestine was a British mandate. So he could get to London, and first of all, he took a job as the tutor to the children of the principal of Jews College. Jews College was the much less intense sort of British equivalent of the Hildesheim Seminary. And it was headed by Rabbi Dr Israel Epstein, another of these great geniuses from the East who came west. And he became his tutor to his children. That became interesting later on, because before he left for Australia, Rabbi Epstein, who was editing the Sonsino translation of the Talmud, asked Rabbi Porush to translate 2 of the tractates of the Talmud. That was the level of confidence he had in his Talmudic ability to be the translator for those 2 slightly obscure Masechtot, those 2 obscure tractates of the Talmud. He gets the job as the rabbi of the Finchley Synagogue in London, quite new at that time, recently founded, and growing massively. It grew from a handful of members to several hundred over the course of his 6 years at Finchley Synagogue. It's a coincidence, because Rabbi Porush came from Finchley to Sydney, and my predecessor, Rabbi Lawrence, went from Sydney back to Finchley. So we've repaid the compliment to Sydney. In 1938, Rabbi Hertz, who's the chief rabbi, offered Rabbi Porush the job of rabbi of the Melbourne Hebrew congregation, Turak, a job which had been vacated because Rabbi Israel Brody was leaving it to come back to England. He later became chief rabbi himself. So that the most prestigious job in those days in Melbourne was up for grabs, and it was offered to Rabbi Porush, and he refused it. He wasn't interested because he felt that he was happy in London. London was an exciting place to be, and he wanted to stay in London. However, by 1939, when the pulpit of the Great Synagogue in Sydney became available, he changes his mind. Things are getting more dangerous in Europe. We're now post-Kristallnacht. War is looming. He felt it was the right thing for him and his family to come to Australia, to be as far away from Europe and its troubles as possible. So he's offered the job in 1939, and he takes the job in 1940, and he arrives and begins his tenure at the Great Synagogue. Now that move was very interesting in itself, because the Great Synagogue was rather like the less traditional of the Orthodox synagogues in London. It had adopted almost all of the reforms which were permitted by the chief rabbi in London and applied them to Sydney, and in fact gone even further. So, for example, there was a mixed choir, which there was in some synagogues in London. The Bimah, as we know, was at the front and not in the centre. The Haftarah was read in English. The lesson from the prophets after the reading of the Torah was read in English. The 10 Commandments were read once a month. Rabbi Cohen, his predecessor but one, had got rid of the prayers for rain and the prayers for dew on Sukkot and Shavuot, Sukkot and Pesach. There were a whole range of these liturgical reforms which had been introduced to the great, and yet at the same time he was happy to take the job. So here you see a certain pragmatism in his approach. He eased most of these innovations or reforms out, not the mixed choir, oddly, but most of this he eased out over the course of his tenure in Sydney. But he was at least willing to come to a synagogue which had all of these, not eccentricities exactly, but certainly departures from the mainstream Orthodox approach. So now we've met Rabbi Porush now, we've seen how he developed, his influences, Jerusalem, Berlin, London, and now let's have a look at the main planks of his theological views and how he set them out. So let's begin with a big one, let's begin with God. So when I started reading Rabbi Porush seriously to write, well, this is going to be an article, I hope, which will be published in the next year or so, what struck me was actually some of the commonalities with the ideas of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. As I said, they were students together in Berlin, and they were also colleagues in Sydney. And there are certain areas of overlap in their theology. So if you read God, Man and History, which is Rabbi Berkovitz's a major theological work, he talks about two issues which come across very powerfully also in Rabbi Porush's writing. One is the very concept of God, because any philosophical understanding of God, including the Jewish one, stresses his total transcendence, that he's infinite, he's incomprehensible to human beings, he is totally other, he's the ultimate other. That's what we all know. And yet at the same time, he is a God that we can talk to and talks back to us and judges us and requires things of us and gives us his love and his compassion. And these two things are very difficult to reconcile. How can you have a God who is totally transcendent, who is totally other, and at the same time, a God who is in relationship with the world? And Rabbi Berkovitz tackles that problem in God, Man and History, and Rabbi Porush also tackles it in his own writings. And he just says, let me quote you. He says, on the one hand, God is transcendent and above nature and outside nature, but on the other, he is immanent in the world in the sense that he, in his infinite grace, takes an interest in man and reveals him the moral law by which he should live. In the Bible, it becomes clear on every page that God is not an impersonal being, a mathematical principle or a final cause remote from the affairs of man. On the contrary, God is active ruler and judge of all men. And that's very reminiscent of Berkovitz, because Berkovitz takes issue with what he calls, quote, the God of the philosophers, this mathematical principle, this final cause. So that is not the religious figure that we know, that, or the religious being, or the being understood in the religious mindset. And that is also the idea of God that Porush rejects. In addition, and this is explicit in Berkovitz and implicit in Porush, he takes the Bible as his source of data about God. Berkovitz says, if you want to know about God, read the Bible. There you will get your information on the way God behaves and the nature of God. And Porush is doing the same thing. He says, yes, we know that God is this totally transcendent being, but look at the Bible. In the Bible, you will find how God is described, and that is also true about God. Now, what Berkovitz does is takes an extra step. He says we have the God as God, and then there is the God in relationship. And that's an aspect of God, the God that chooses to come into relationship with human beings. How that works, how there can be both an absolutely infinite God and a God relationship, we don't understand, but we know it's true because that's what the Bible tells us. And Porush, in a slightly more less worked out way, is doing the same thing. He says both these things are true, and we know they're true because the Bible tells us. The Bible is the source of information about the way God works. It's also, by the way, something you find in Hirsch. And of course, both Berkovitz and Porush came under the strong influence of Hirschianism at their seminary in Berlin. So, for example, Hirsch says this: God is not some eternal ancient one of days, who having created the world now reposes in the depth of his eternal existence. He is the living, ever-ruling God, from whom not only the whole past originated, but who also grants every coming moment in accordance with the educational requirements of mankind. God is interested in developing us. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to improve us. Now, how does he do that? He does that through halakha. So the codes of Jewish law, the legal requirements for living, are the way that God chooses to educate us. And so Rabbi Porush does turn himself in a pamphlet about kashrut, about Jewish dietary laws, which was released in 1947. He does talk about his philosophy of mitzvot and halacha. He says Judaism is not primarily interested in abstract theories and creeds, but rather with, quote, practical human expressions. It does not elaborate the philosophy of holiness. It rather tries to purify the life of men through sanctifying observances. In other words, God is primarily interested in what we do. Yes, we have to know or believe certain things about God and the world, but he's primarily interested in how we behave. And here we come across another very significant overlap between Rabbi Porush and Rabbi Berkovitz, that the purpose of the commandments, or one purpose of the commandments, not the entire purpose, but one purpose according to Berkovitz, is we are trained up in areas which are not necessarily important in and of themselves, in order that when we come across a real ethical challenge, we can confront it and face it down. So if you are trained your whole life not to eat ham sandwiches, which in itself isn't a bad thing, that's an arbitrary prohibition not to eat a ham sandwich. There's nothing inherently bad about ham. That's very non-mystical, by the way, a non-mystical understanding of the power otherwise of non-kosher foods. It's simply that God told you not to. It's not because there's something inherently impure about them. It's because God said don't eat them, that's why you can't eat them. So if you're trained in that self-discipline your whole life, when you come to a real ethical dilemma, your muscles in self-control are already developed. And therefore you will withstand the really important ethical temptation. And that's what Rabbi Berkovitz calls the indirect method. This is what Rabbi Porush writes. He says this: we must so train our character in good deeds that at a moment of challenge, our reaction will be almost instinctively virtuous. So we train our character to resist temptation, so that when we get a real temptation that would really be problematic, then we can triumph over it because we've developed those muscles of self-control and self-discipline. Also very Hirschian and German, as I'm sure you can hear, this idea of discipline, self-control being at the cornerstone of holiness, which is what Rabbi Porush says. Holiness comes from self-control. Quote, the subjugation of our base instincts to higher demands brings us closer to God, and that is the fundamental purpose of Judaism. Now, what's interesting about Rabbi Porush's analysis of Hirschianism and Torah Derech Eretz is that he identifies it pretty much wholeheartedly with what we would call modern orthodoxy. He just says, Torah Derech Eretz, quote, the philosophy of modern or moderate or centrist orthodoxy. He doesn't see a distinction between Hirsch and Torah Derech Eretz and modern orthodoxy. Now that is not a straightforward statement at all, because there are major differences between Hirschianism and modern orthodoxy as it's understood today. For example, Zionism. Hirsch was not a Zionist. He was an anti-Zionist. Now, he died in 1888, so we don't really know what his views of Zionism would have been in the 20th century. Although the Breuer community in the northern part of Manhattan in Washington Heights, who saw themselves as the inheritors of the Hirsch-Breuer community in Frankfurt, remained anti-Zionist. And not only that, they remained firm opponents of Yeshiva University, which is just a few blocks away in the same neighborhood. Yeshiva University was and is the stronghold, the citadel of modern orthodoxy in America, in the world. And the Breuer community always said, no, we are not modern orthodox. Hirschianism and Torah Derech Eretz are not modern orthodox at all. They're two quite different and quite distinct modes of thought. But Rabbi Porush, who identified himself as a modern orthodox rabbi and who came from a Hirschian background, a complicated Hirschian background, but nevertheless strongly influenced by Hirschianism, just identifies one with the other. We've seen how he comes from an anti-Hasidic family, although he is influenced by Rabbi Kaplan, who is interested in Hasidut in Berlin, and he has Hasidic fellow students at the seminary. And so he also has this ambivalent attitude towards Hasidut. He wrote this about the Chabad Lubavitch movement, which of course arrived in Sydney during his tenure and became very important, really after he retired mostly, but he certainly was a witness to becoming very important in Australia. He wrote this: one need not agree with the whole philosophy and mode of orthodoxy of this Hasidic movement, and indeed there is much in the way of life and in its adoration of the Rebbe and its isolation from the wider world which is unacceptable. Personally, I am averse to any kind of extremism and try to adhere to the philosophy of Maimonides of Torah Umada. Now that's fascinating as well, because Maimonides never used the term Torah Umada. Torah Umada is the motto of Yeshiva University. So again, he is just identifying very straightforwardly this medieval rabbi with the contemporary stronghold of modern orthodoxy. He defines it as loyalty to Torah and mitzvot, in belief and in practice, with a general education in worldly knowledge. I strongly believe this ideology of moderation and realism will prevail in the end. So here she's tied in there as well, this reference to general education and worldly knowledge. We now have Maimonides, Hirsch, and modern orthodoxy and YU all brought into the same box, as it were. Now, of course, that's an intellectual modern orthodoxy. This commitment to broad knowledge and skepticism about Hasidut, this is all on the intellectual side of the equation. What about the practical element? Well, there's also a practical, sociological modern orthodoxy which you see in Rabbi Porush's attitudes, because as I mentioned, he was willing to come to a community which had all sorts of variations from the traditional approach in several areas, and he permitted that. And in the case of mixed choirs, that lasted his entire time as the rabbi of the synagogue. But it was also something he promoted. He promoted a certain pragmatism and a certain realism in the way he wanted the Jews in Sydney to behave. For example, he felt that it was very important that even those who were non-observant belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. He didn't make observance the entry ticket into his Orthodox synagogue and thought it shouldn't be the entry ticket into any Orthodox synagogue. It should be, if the person concerned was not 100% observant in every area of their life, that was regrettable, but at least a commitment to, at least a membership of an Orthodox synagogue showed where their aspirations were, show what they wanted to be, what they believed to be the proper way. That's something picked up, I think, from London, where almost all 80% of the Jewish population who belong to a synagogue belong to an Orthodox synagogue, whatever their personal level of observance might be. He felt it was an important statement of what you valued. He also went into details. He was aware in the 1940s that people couldn't necessarily keep Shabbat. The demands of work made it very difficult for them to keep Shabbat. And he addressed them directly in a pamphlet on Shabbat, which was published in 1946. He said this: many assume that if we cannot fulfill every mitzvah, they are exempt from all. If we break a law from that we deem a necessity, we are not justified in disregarding others. Let no one say, the Sabbath is lost to me anyhow, because I feel I have to break some of its laws. Let his conscience guide him, and let him return to full observance of the Sabbath at the first opportunity. If you are unable to go to every Shabbos to the synagogue, go whenever you can and bring your children with you. So a very pragmatic and realistic approach. I don't expect you to keep Shabbos, but do what you can. Return to Shabbos observance when you're able to, and just come to shul. Come to shul as often as you can and bring your children. That's the most important thing. We've seen how he comes from all angles, a very anti-reform background, and he does maintain that position also in Sydney. He has quite bitter things to say about the reform movement. As we've seen, he's critical of Chabad. He's also critical of the reform movement. He writes, the reform movement advocated the radical adjustment of Judaism to the spirit of the time and the elimination of some of the most sacred laws and traditions of our faith. It preached assimilation and endangered the foundations of Judaism and the survival of the Jewish people. A wave of conversion, intermarriage, and religious anarchy followed, which all but decimated the Jewish community. So that's a pretty rough indictment in his eyes of the reform movement. At the same time, he said that when it came to practical issues in the Jewish community, there should be cooperation. A modus vivendi had to be created in which there could be, when it came to Israel, when it came to the provision of social services, when it came to protecting the rights of Jewish communities, vis-a-vis the secular authorities in Australia, they had to be working together. As he said, a kind of coexistence which retains the unity of the community, cooperation in secular matters, separation in religious matters. Now, even that was much too far for Hirsch. Hirsch would never have accepted that approach. Hirsch would never have joined the Board of Deputies, for example, because non-Orthodox organizations were present within it. So this is a move beyond Hirsch, a move much closer to London, the model in London, where all the strains of Judaism belong to the Board of Deputies in Britain, but in religious matters, things are kept separate. So that is definitely a deviation from Hirsch's approach, a much more moderate position, even if his rhetoric was very strong. And even amazingly, the last article he ever published in the Great Synagogue Journal in 1991 was another attack against reform. So his last public pronouncement essentially was anti-reform, and yet, contrary to Hirsch, he was not willing to break off entirely. This is a Berlin approach and not a Frankfurt approach. I mentioned briefly Zionism, how Zionism is a big break for Rabbi Porush from the Hirschian position. But Rabbi Porush's Zionism was what you might call the pre-1967 moderate religious Zionist position of the religious parties in Israel before the Six-Day War. After the Six-Day War, it became much more messianic and much more about expansion of the land and conquering and keeping the whole of the land of Israel. That was not Rabbi Porush's approach, but he did see the land of Israel, the state of Israel rather, as a sign of divine favor and as a sign of a blessing and a miraculous intervention. He said, Medinat Israel is undoubtedly a positive force in the struggle for Jewish survival throughout the world and may develop into the powerhouse we need so badly in the scattered and exposed communities of the diaspora. He said about the Six-Day War that its victory was revolutionary in Jewish history. He said he saw the finger of God at work when it came to that victory. He even saw divine intervention in the discussions of the United Nations. He said it was a, quote, minor redemption, even if the full messianic moment was yet to come. So he doesn't quite believe we're in a messianic state, and therefore everything which is conquered must be retained, but he very much sees the state of Israel as a bestowal of divine blessing and a divine gift, and delivered by miracles sent by God. This, as I say, is an approach which you see in the pre-67 religious leadership, and which was radicalized after 1967, but not in the case of Rabbi Porush. I want to look at two more areas before I pause and happy to take questions. One is interfaith relations. He did not believe in real interfaith dialogue. He was not in favor of putting our doctrines on the table and others putting their doctrines on the table and making a sort of compromise so that we can all get along better. He did not believe that there should be a dialogue which could lead to any sort of religious movement, theological movement. At the same time, he founded the Council of Christians and Jews in 1943 in order to corral all the different church groups to condemn Nazi atrocities, and then more broadly to promote shared religious ideals of and against materialism and secularism in all its forms, and to promote friendship and good feeling between different faith communities. So for him, interfaith work was about building good personal relationships and also about pursuing shared objectives, keeping a place of faith in the public sphere and the private sphere, promoting that, but not the real deep theological work which takes place, let's say, between Catholics and Lutherans about how they can find middle ground and sign a joint document of doctrines they both believe in. So no, Jews believe what Jews believe, and Christians believe what Christians believe, and those two can never meet. Judaism for Rabbi Porush is just a superior faith. Christianity is not something he wants to cast judgment upon, but he also says that, quote, Jerusalem is more relevant to the ultimate salvation of humanity than Athens or Rome. Judaism is just a more significant and a more authentic divine message to the world than anything else, including Christianity. But he also says that real tolerance is reflected in the words of the prophet Micah. Let all the peoples walk each in the name of its God, and we will go in the name of the Lord our God. That is true tolerance. When he talks about the name of the other gods, it's lowercase n, lowercase g. These are not real gods. Let people worship them if that's what they want to do. Good for them. We're not going to try and stop them, each their own. But the name of our God is capital N, capital G. That's a real God. So there's no pluralism here. There is rather tolerance, each to their own, but we, Rabbi Porush, know what the truth is. A final theme I want to touch on briefly is something which interested me enormously and surprised me, and that's Rabbi Porush's deep pessimism. All the way through his work, you find reiterations of a deep pessimism, anxiety, fear, concern, worry about the world and the state of Judaism. The title of his collection of sermons is Today's Challenge to Judaism. Not Judaism's challenge to the world, but how Judaism is being challenged by today. And so he says several times, even when he allows himself moments of hope and optimism, it's often followed by, if it's there at all, followed by a sort of note of gloom. For example, in his inaugural sermon, he said, "As to the house of Israel, the sight thereof is most discouraging." This is 1940. "We may notice an alarming subsidence of the loyalty of our sons and daughters to the faith of their fathers. The abyss of the generations is cleaving ever wider. There is an appalling ignorance of the sacred language of the Bible and prayer book." In the 1950s, he talked about the, quote, quite deplorable state of orthodoxy in Australia, which has stagnated for lack of vision. In the 1960s, he pointed to the path that leads to, quote, anonymity, disintegration, and dishonor, the road of inner insecurity and emptiness. And even at the end of his life, he says, our new generation is utterly weak in its Jewish education and in its religious observance. The ideas and the ways of life of this environment are making frightening inroads into the lives of the vast majority of our sons and daughters. So all the way through, a man who was himself very embracing of wider learning and wider culture, nevertheless is very fearful of the negative impact that could have on the continuity of the Jewish people. So what do we find in Rabbi Porush? Well, as I reflected on these, all of these different elements of his thought, it struck me that you could see it as a bundle of contradictions, or at least very significant tensions. He's a Hirschian who's also a Zionist. He is a battler against reform who also cooperates with them in communal matters. He's an advocate of secular learning who also thinks it's corrosive to Jewish life. He's a pioneer of interfaith who rejects theological dialogue. He's a religious pragmatist, but also uncompromising in his in asserting that halakha is the way that one ought to live. He's a tremendous community builder who also sees disintegration hovering just over the horizon. So you could see these as contradictions, or you could see them as the collection of ideas of an independent thinker who takes from his different sources of inspiration and education the elements which resonate with him, and also which reflects his understanding of a complex world and a complex religious reality, which requires a complicated and nuanced and not cookie cutter set of religious responses. that is where I shall leave it, and I'm happy for the remainder of the time we have to take a few questions.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Elton, for that fascinating talk. We do have time for a few questions, and we've got some queued up. So Phil, I'm just unmuting you now if you'd like to ask your question, or if you can unmute yourself if you have that available. Okay, doesn't seem to be working. I'll ask it on Phil's behalf. So he's asked you to consider the role of Mrs. Porush in Rabbi Porush's philosophy.
Well, Rabbi Porush writes, when he mentions his wife, in terms of great respect and tremendous gratitude for the way that she supported him in his rabbinate. She was from a distinguished rabbinic family in Berlin. Further than that, I couldn't really tell you. I'll give you one interesting thing about Mrs. Porush, which Rabbi Porush wrote to Rabbi Apple in a letter, which I've seen and cannot relocate for footnoting purposes. And if I can't find it, I shan't be able to include it. But he said he was always against his wife wearing a sheitel. He never wanted his wife to wear a sheitel. I think, and of course, and during her time in Sydney, she wore a hat in shul but didn't cover her hair otherwise. I think this is part of his self-conscious, moderate stance, which he exemplified, implemented in various aspects of his religious life and his rabbinic life. That's not quite an answer to your question, but at least it's Mrs. Porush related.
Karen Pryor, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you, Rabbi Elton. That was fantastic. I had this sense of this very structured rabbi from Berlin via London arriving in a very relaxed Sydney. And I wondered what the impact of Rabbi Porush's tenure was on the culture of the great. Have you got a sense of the culture of the great before Rabbi Porush arrived? And for example, by the time he handed over to Rabbi Apple?
Yes, that's very interesting. So I'll tell you what he claims. He claims that the place became much warmer in during his tenure. That when he arrived, I mean, we can ignore the very brief, less than 3-year tenure of Rabbi Levi, who came and went in a sort of cloud of controversy. It was really the creation of Rabbi Cohen, Rabbi Francis Lyon Cohen, the most Anglo of the Anglos you could possibly hope to come across, had been the chief minister from 1905 until his death in 1934. And really he'd imposed or cultivated a deeply, deeply Anglicized, even Anglican feeling. And this was certainly shared by the honorary officers. In the archives, you get these letters in the 1940s saying to Rabbi Porush, will you please make sure that your ministers do not slouch on the bimmer during the service? Like extraordinarily uptight approach from the honorary officers. And he says, although people might these days come to synagogue, without wearing a tie, it's a much warmer place than it was when I arrived. He was a native Yiddish speaker. He could, although fewer Yiddish-speaking Jews who came to Sydney came to the Great than came to Central, for example, he was nevertheless much more sympathetic and much more Hamish in his own way, even with Berlin under his belt, than Rabbi Cohen had been, who was, a true blue Englishman. So that's how I think he thought he changed the Great, and I think how he had changed the Great. He just made it a little less formal, a little less rigid, and a little less frigid than it was when he arrived.
Wonderful. We have Rabbi Porush's daughter Naomi who would like to say something. Please go ahead, Naomi.
Okay, first of all, I wanted to congratulate you. I was very, very much impressed by your presentation of my father. I don't want to take up time now, but if you come to Israel, I'd be delighted if you would contact me and we can get together and have a little chat about both my parents.
That'd be lovely, thank you. I'd be delighted, that's very kind, thank you.
Okay.
Ronnie Schnapp, I'm just unmuting you now if you'd like to ask your question as well.
Thank you. Pardon me, I'm a bit hoarse. Rabbi Elton, you mentioned some of Rabbi Porush's practical halachic views, particularly Jewry at the time, and his contemporary Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. Would Rabbi Porush have agreed with Rabbi Berkovitz's views on women in Judaism, particularly around marriage and divorce?
So Ronnie's bringing up Rabbi Berkovitz's later work on issues of marriage and divorce, and also the status of women in Judaism. I don't think Rabbi Porush was as radical as Rabbi Berkovitz was by any means. I think he was a much more conventional halakhic worker and thinker. Of course, he ran the Sydney Beth Din under the initially under the oversight of the chief rabbi in London, but then basically independently for most of his time. And he wasn't doing that level of, he wasn't pursuing that sort of those radical approaches. That's very much Rabbi Berkovitz's project on his own. And of course, they didn't get on very well in Sydney because there was tensions over who would be on the Beth Din and who would run the Beth Din. And Rabbi Berkovitz was only here for 4 years, so he didn't really develop into anything. But there were certainly tensions about, there could have been tensions about the halakhic direction of the community.
Fantastic. Adam Rosenblum, I'm just unmuting you now if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, Rabbi. Well done for a fantastic presentation. He was said to have, I think you alluded to his response with regards to Shabbat observance. It was said that he said if people were going to drive on Shabbat anyway, he would prefer them to drive to shul than drive somewhere else. And he also, tolerated the mixed choir. In any of his writings, did he document his halakhic reasoning behind those positions?
Yes. So, well, I think there's a difference between Rabbi Porush on driving to shul and, let's say, the conservative movement responser of 1950. What he wasn't prepared to do was to put into a formal responser, it is permitted to drive to shul for these reasons. He said, it's not permitted to drive to shul. It's not permitted to drive anywhere, but I want to see you in shul, and leave it at that. So not joining the dots, just to say it's important people come to shul, and I'm not going to concern myself with how they get there, because in a pragmatic way, attendance at shul is the most important thing, but not actually endorsing the act of driving in itself. That's where and then when the chance comes to pull back from it immediately and return to full observance. So if the only way you can get to shul, let's say, is by driving, then I like to see you in shul. But as soon as another way can be found to go to shul another way. He says very interestingly in his memoirs, the Journal of an Australian Rabbi, he says that orthodoxy is not about this observance or that observance, about whether there's a mixed choir or there's not a mixed choir, even whether you wear a kippah or you pray in English or Hebrew. So that's not what orthodoxy is about. Orthodoxy is about believing that the Torah came from God on Mount Sinai and that we are bound by it. And beyond that, we do our best. But as long as one maintains and adheres to the basic principles of faith and the system of authority, whether there's this deviation or that deviation is not the most important thing. What matters is the basic structure of belief that you attach yourself to. That's what differentiates your orthodoxy and non-orthodoxy.
Okay, and we have time for one last question from Ellie.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi.
Thank you for bringing to life a rabbi whose name I've seen on many family documents and, of course, at the shul. We just wanted to ask, and forgive me if we missed an example of it, but just like you mentioned last week in your Facebook drasha that Rabbi Apple introduced duchening at the Great. What is the ritual legacy of Rabbi Porush that we might recognize if we were to come to the Great on Shabbos?
Yes, I'll give you a very nice example of that. So Rabbi Cohen was of the view that because the seasons are a different way around in Sydney, instead of praying for rain on Sukkot and dew on Pesach, we should pray for rain on Pesach and dew on Sukkot. So what he did was he actually did away with both of those prayers and wrote one of his own, which was a sort of worked for both festivals in his view. And Rabbi Porush came along and just got rid of all that and just returned the prayer for dew and the prayer for rain the way it's done in the Northern Hemisphere. He also got rid of the reading of the Ten Commandments once a month. He got rid of the Haftarah in English. The only survival of that, by the way, is what we still do, is reading the book of Jonah in English on Yom Kippur in the afternoon. But there were two big changes which he brought to the liturgy of the synagogue.
Tamara Grunberg, who I believe is Rabbi Porush's granddaughter, would just like to make a comment as well, and then we'll finish up.
Thank you.
Please go ahead, Tamara.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Rabbi Elton for a wonderful lecture here. Rabbi Porush, of course, was my grandfather. What I really wanted to say was, I mean, obviously we see all his wonderful thoughts and things that he passed on, which I'm happy to see are also in the shul. But what I really want to say was I don't make rabbanim like my grandfather anymore. It's something I feel that we miss, someone who has the intellectual combined with a real heart. And I think everyone who he spoke to, who was ever meeting with him, they were the whole world, and he made them feel really important. I see also that Mark Simons is here. His grandfather too, Rabbi Friedman, they were two of a kind in that way, and we just wish we had more Rabbanim like both of them around today. So thank you very much.
Thank you for joining.